3 years ago, the United Nations commissioned the world's top scientists to find out if global warming could be limited. On Monday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published the answer. Yes, we can limit global warming and prevent a climate catastrophe. It is possible. But there's a deadline. We need to build a global net zero carbon emission economy by 2050. Now, while this will mean different things for different businesses, the most polluting industries will need to make the most radical changes. That means no coal, for starters. Australia's Environment Minister, Melissa Price, was quick to respond, saying that she is more focused on bringing down electricity prices than phasing out coal. Of all the different types of fossil fuel, coal produces the most carbon dioxide, and Australia is the biggest producer. Now, as things stand, decarbonising the world's electricity system fast enough to meet the IPCC's targets will involve, at the very least, global consensus, a major paradigm shift, and trillions of dollars. Al Jazeera's Nadeem Baba reports.
The threat's been clear and present for many years. Climate change caused by human activity is putting our very survival in peril. Now the UN's climate change body says concerted action needs to come much sooner than previously thought.
Early action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is possible. There are options available. There are signs that mitigation is going on. But if this is to be achieved, there's an urgent need to accelerate.
3 years ago at the Paris Climate Change Conference, many governments gave themselves a pat on the back. They'd pledged to take action to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now the experts say they're failing and time is running out. The IPCC says meeting that 1.5 degrees target requires a 45% cut in carbon emissions by 2030 and alarmingly zero net carbon emissions by 2050, with steep cuts in other greenhouse gases like methane.
It's a question of whether we can make certain decisions in the coming years where the beneficiaries are going to be our children and our grandchildren and several coming generations.
The IPCC says by the end of this century, global sea level rises would be 10 centimetres lower with warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. And the Arctic is likely to be ice-free in summer around once a century at 1.5 degrees, but at least once a decade if warming reaches 2 degrees. None of this is academic. Faster action will reduce flooding, giving people living on the world's coasts, islands and river deltas time to adapt to climate change. Then there are the millions affected by drought, many on the African continent.
We need to look at climate financing strategies that ensure that we sort of speed up climate action related to issues like agriculture, food security, livelihoods and migrations. And that's because migration is no longer a choice for lots of people in the continent. It is now a must because of global warming.
The IPCC report says renewable energy must account for at least 70% of electricity by 2050, compared with 25% now, to stay within the 1.5 degree limit. Carbon will have to be sucked out of the air by machines and stored underground, and billions of trees will have to be planted. And there'll be tough choices between using land for food or for biofuel crops. We've been shown the solutions, now it's over to our politicians and to us.
Well, right now I'm speaking to you from the Middle East, a region that's petro-dependent and desperately trying to find ways to diversify away from fossil fuel and create jobs for the people who live here. So that's where I started when I caught up with Michael Grubb, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at University College London. He's written several reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I began by asking him what a carbon-free future would look like for this region.
The Middle East obviously has a concern that much of the Middle East is dependent upon oil, not so much on coal, and coal is the first in the line of fire. It's a sort of the biggest sinner in terms of climate change, if you like. But one issue for many in the Middle East is what does the future look like if we do have to curtail oil demand? That's probably going to affect some other regions like oil shales first, because they're actually a bit more expensive and a bit more carbon intensive. But still, we're talking about, rather than the past century largely fueled on expansion of coal and oil, this century being about their contraction and the rise of solar, wind, other renewable sources. So that's the first thing. One needs to think, what's the energy economy of countries, in this case Doha, Middle East, countries traditionally heavy dependence upon oil, significant on gas, though that's kind of both good and bad. It's much cleaner than coal. Britain, we've halved emissions in the power sector, partly by using gas instead of coal.
Is investing in new technology then the way to go? And as far as old technologies are concerned, how much power do we have as investors, those of us who own so-called dirty companies, people who are adding to this pollution? How much power do we have to force these companies to change quickly?
Well, it's always got to depend on who and who's we and where. I mean, in terms of any investors listening, my first advice would be, if you're putting money into coal power stations or mines, you are taking a huge strategic risk on all fronts, whether it's local air pollution, global, the general pressures. Coal is the first in the line of fire, and we've seen dramatic reductions in the UK, much of Europe, even in North America, where President Trump set out to actually protect and indeed subsidise the coal industry. He's not been able to stop its continued decline. I think for others involved in investments, I think it is really, look at the reality, look at the Paris Agreement, look at this report from Monday. And what it does basically, it says, we've already got close to 1 degree warming from pre-industrial levels. And we see the climate impacts around the world. Particularly poor countries have been most in the line of fire of that. The report maps out how much worse would it be if we get to 1.5, how much worse again if we get to 2. Some of those numbers are really striking, some of the data in there. And the science clearly is sharpening up, and I think that will increase government's willingness to act on this issue.
You say that, but that there is a lot of pushback, isn't there? I mean, how much resistance are climate change scientists going to have in trying to persuade governments to take action that's going to ultimately harm their economies, at least in the short term? Australia's Environment Minister, for instance, seems to think, I'm paraphrasing here, that we'll eventually have the technology that will be able to pull CO2 from the atmosphere. So until such time, it's okay to keep on polluting and keep relying or having an economy that relies a lot on coal.
It's an interesting example. We think Washington politics is odd. It's worth looking at Australia. One of the features in Australia is a huge political division, driven partly by the fact that they are an environmentally sensitive country. The coral reef's already suffering. One of the things this report says, incidentally, is the estimate is that at 1.5 degrees warming, we lose something like 70 to 90% of the world's coral. If that goes on up to 2 degrees, they're talking about 99%. Now, those kind of statistics kind of give you a sense of what we're dealing with, similar sort of magnitudes around of change around Arctic ice, for example. But you ask about Australia. I think the politicians are finding that it's not very popular to say nah, we're not going to do anything about it, it's too hard. That it is also, I think, not very credible to say, well, trust us, one day we'll work out how to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Again, the report says, sure, there might be some negative emission options out there. Some of them are probably more to do with good land use and avoiding deforestation and new reforestation, because the big industrial, let's suck it out or clean it up afterwards and find somewhere to dump it, actually is big and expensive and involves a lot of problems. So politicians may try to use it as a get-out clause, but I don't think they'll get very far. The other thing in Australia, again, you have this oddity of a government that appears desperately trying to protect the most carbon-intensive and polluting source, and failing, because it's being undercut by renewables. Australia is a sunny place, it's a windy place. We see some regions like South Australia declaring they're going to go for 100% renewables, whatever the federal government says.
What about the elephant in the room here, though, Michael? China. To what extent does it not matter what the rest of us do? If China's not on board, we're still going to end up in trouble climate-wise.
I think one of the big changes in the political dynamics in the last 10 years has been the Chinese position. They're emitting substantially more now than the United States. But I think the thing that's really shifted the politics in China has been local air pollution. What we see is a tremendous drive from the central government to try and close down old inefficient coal power stations, put clamps on what had been a massive program of coal power station construction. Beijing has basically banned coal burning in its regions and is now set to ban petrol-driven cars because of the local air pollution. What I see is a big shift in terms of both its energy policy and its geopolitical positioning to say, of course China has to be part of the solution, and we intend China to do well out of the solution by being involved in the emerging clean technology businesses.
Professor, really good to talk to you. Michael, many thanks indeed for being with us.